Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. First, let me take you to the past. Gertrude Coppard was 23 when she met Walter Morel at a Christmas dance. Walter was an unrefined coal miner. Yet she liked him because he was lively and he liked her because she was reserved. They fell in love and got married. At first, their marriage was happy, but Gertrude soon realized they did not have much in common. Gertrude came from a middle-class family. Her father was an engineer. After marriage, over time, she began to feel restless. When she tried to talk to her husband, he shut down. They argued, and Walter went to the pub. This became a daily routine. Eventually, Gertrude became cold toward her husband. 2 years passed. Gertrude gave birth to her first child, William. After William was born, their relationship deteriorated further. She focused more on her baby. This made Mr. Morel jealous. Gertrude was depressed, and Mr. Morel spent more time away from home. Gertrude was very proud of her son, William. She loved his long blonde hair. Mr. Morel was often strict with him. One morning, Gertrude found that Mr. Morel had cut William's hair off. She was furious, and this made her turn more against her husband. Mr. Morel drank often and spent most evenings at the pub. He got into trouble at work for not following orders, and his wages were low. Meanwhile, they had a second child, this time a daughter, Annie. Now, we reach the present. 8 years have passed. Gertrude is 31. We can now safely call her Mrs. Morel. She is again pregnant, this time with a third child. Just 3 weeks ago, they moved from Bestwood to the Bottoms. Mrs. Morel is not happy with this relocation. She hates this new place. Why? Let's know a few things about the Bottoms. The Bottoms is a housing estate for coal miners. During the Industrial Revolution, many coal mines opened in northern England to meet high demand. Coal was vital for industry and as a source of light and heat. Large companies took over and revived old mines, connecting them with railways. The Bottoms has 6 blocks, each with 12 houses. Bestwood had nicer houses. The Bottoms was at the foot of a hill below those nice houses. The front of the house faces the street with neat gardens and flowers, but the back opens into a grimy alley with ash pits filled with smog and pollution. Now, back to our story. Near her due date, a fair comes to town. William really wants to go. Mrs. Morel is not very enthusiastic, but she goes to please William. She is worried her husband will use the fair as his excuse to drink. William buys egg cups for his mother, and he's proud that she looks like a lady. Mrs. Morel goes home early. When William returns, he tells her that he saw his father working in the bar tent for drinks. Mrs. Morel feels burdened by her pregnancy. She accuses Mr. Morel of his drinking habit. He denies it, and she gets tired of his excuses. They start sleeping apart. Mr. Morel plans a day out with his friend Jerry. Now, Mrs. Morel hates Jerry because Jerry thinks men are superior to women. So, Mr. Morel hides the plan from his wife. They drink and gamble that day. Mrs. Morel has a miserable day at home. She makes dinner and waits for her husband. When Mr. Morel returns drunk, she snaps at him. She says, She would have left him long ago if not for the children. Mr. Morel locks her out of the house. Alone in the dark, she feels frightened, but soon starts to be comforted by nature in the moonlit garden. Finally, Mr. Morel lets her in, but they do not speak to each other. After that night, Mr. Morel feels ashamed. His behavior changes. He starts spending more time at home. He even helps with the household chores. Mrs. Morel appreciates his assistance. Soon, she goes into labor and gives birth to another son. This time, the child is fair with blue eyes. Mr. Morel arrives home late to find his wife and the new baby. Mrs. Morel feels her life revolves around her children. She is especially close to William. William becomes upset when she is ill or in pain, although he does not like his new brother and finds him nasty. Mr. Heaton, a young clergyman, visits her daily and becomes the child's godfather. She enjoys his visits. She feels sorry for him because his young wife recently has died. One evening, Mr. Morel comes home early while Mr. Heaton is there. Mr. Morel shows his dislike for Mr. Heaton's job and acts rudely. He says that the clergyman knows nothing about real hard work and so on. Mr. Heaton feels unwelcome and leaves. William is disgusted by his father's behavior. Mrs. Morel undermines her husband's authority and Mr. Morel tries to assert control. His wife laughs at him. So Mr. Morel limits on money and drinks even more. One Friday night, Mr. Morel comes home late and drunk. He demands dinner from Mrs. Morel, but she refuses. Mr. Morel gets angry. He throws a drawer at her. It cuts her head. She pushes him away when he shows concern. Blood drips on Paul, and he helps her clean up. The next day, Mr. Morel drinks to ease his guilt, but never apologizes. He blames her instead. A week later, Mrs. Morel notices Mr. Morel is stealing money from her purse. She confronts him, and he gets angry. He packs his things and leaves. Mrs. Morel panics, worrying about providing for the children, but she knows he won't go far. As expected, Mr. Morel comes back at night. He wants Mrs. Morel to feel grateful for his return. Mrs. Morel feels bitter about her life. Mr. Morel falls ill for weeks, and his wife nurses him back to health. After recovering, he pretends to be still sick for attention. Instead, Mrs. Morel focuses on William, planning joyfully for his future. Her husband feels left out. When Paul is 17 months old, another boy, Arthur, is born. Gertrude is pleased that Arthur loves his father and his father loves him back. William excels in school and he is the smartest boy in his class. When he was 11, he gets into a fight and rips another boy's collar. The boy's mother complains to Mrs. Morel. William's father wants to whip William, but Mrs. Morel threatens him, saying he will regret it if he touches their son. Around this time, Mrs. Morel joins the Women's Guild in town, part of the Bestwood Cooperative Wholesale Society. There, women discuss social benefits and developments. Mrs. Morel enjoys intellectual work and her children like seeing her happy. Some husbands object to the guild because it makes their wives criticize their lives and treatment at home. When William is 13, his mother gets him a job at the co-op office, though Mr. Morel wants him to work in the mines. William attends night school. He becomes an excellent clerk and bookkeeper. He excels in sports and dancing. He gives his money to his mother. When he is 19, he takes a new job in an office in Nottingham. Annie, Gertrude's daughter, studies to become a teacher. Paul learns French and German from Mr. Heaton While Arthur is still in school, William grows into an ambitious young man. He socializes with wealthy people in town and has many girlfriends. Mrs. Morel disapproves of these girls and dislikes his social life. After a year, William gets a higher paying job offer in London. Though his mother is sad to let him go, William leaves for London. With William gone, Mrs. Morel focuses entirely on Paul. Paul is resolved and loves his mother. He witnesses his parents' fights and hopes his father dies soon. He finds solace in nature. He helps his mother and siblings during tough times. When Paul falls ill, he only seeks comfort from his mother. It deepens their bond. He feels grateful to her and tries to meet her expectations. When Paul wins a prize for his painting, Mrs. Morel encourages him to tell his father, but Paul finds it impossible to communicate with him. Once William and Annie have jobs, Paul has to collect his father's wages from the public house. He hates the task. In the summer, when the mines close early, Mr. Morel is home all day. This makes Mrs. Morel frustrated. William writes regularly from London. He is coming home for Christmas. The family is excited and prepares to welcome him. William arrives with lavish gifts and fancy sweets for everyone. Neighbors come by to admire the gentleman William has become. The holiday is a wonderful success, and everyone is heartbroken when William leaves. His mother feels numb, paralyzed. She loves William passionately. Now, Mr. Morel often has accidents, and his wife is used to his minor injuries. But when he severely injures his leg and is hospitalized, she visits him regularly. Paul manages the household and is happy without his father. He enjoys painting, but he keeps on looking for a job to support the family for his mother's sake. He dreams of sharing a cottage with his mother after his father dies. Meanwhile, William is successful in the city with a job in a law firm, but stops sending money home. Paul gets an interview with Thomas Jordan, a surgical appliances manufacturer in Nottingham. Mrs. Morel travels with him to Nottingham. Paul is happy to have his mother with him, and this becomes like an adventure. He secures the job, and Mrs. Morel is delighted. They go out for dinner to celebrate. After dining, they enjoy a walk around the shops and return home by train. Paul feels he had the perfect day with his mother. Next day, Paul buys a season ticket for the train to travel to Nottingham. It is expensive. Mrs. Morel complains that William never sends her money. He spends everything on his girlfriend. He even buys her a gold bangle. Paul is irritated when his mother has to use her savings to pay for his ticket. William sends a photograph of his girlfriend, Louisa Lily Denise Weston. Mrs. Morel finds the photograph indecent because Louisa had bare shoulders in it. Paul starts working. His mother is proud of him. His job is to fetch letters for copying and report to his supervisor, Mr. Pappleworth. Paul quickly adapts to his job and grows to like his supervisor. He gets along well with the women who work there. He eats lunch and dinner with Polly every day. Paul knows all the women personally and enjoys talking with them. He often sits with Fanny, who is a hunchback, but who adores him. He enjoys working at the factory and likes the people there. Each night, he gives his mother his earnings and tells her about his day. Mrs. Morel loves hearing about his life. As Arthur grows up, he becomes strong but careless and impulsive like his father. He dislikes work and has a temper. He hates his father too. Arthur wins a scholarship to a grammar school in Nottingham and lives with his aunt during the week, coming home only on weekends. Annie has already left and works as a teacher. Mrs. Morel relies even more on Paul, sharing her worries and thoughts with him when he gets home in the evening. By now, William is engaged to Lily and brings her home for Christmas. Lily, with her fine airs, is clearly out of place. She sees the Morels as inferiors and treats Annie and Paul like servants. William notices this and doesn't like it. Paul receives a raise at work. He and his mother take a trip to farmhouse of the Levers. They spend the afternoon with Mrs. Levers and her 3 sons and daughter Miriam. William returns home again in October, showing his mother a rash on his throat. When he's back in London, Mrs. Morel receives a telegram saying he is ill. When she arrives, she finds him unconscious and alone in his room for 2 days. William is diagnosed with pneumonia. Hours later, he dies. The Morels have his body returned home for burial. For the next 3 months, Mrs. Morel feels miserable. She even shuts out from Paul. At Christmas, Paul returns from work and tells his mother he feels sick. He too has pneumonia, worsened by his long travel. The illness gets worse, and Paul nearly loses consciousness. Mrs. Morel lovingly tends to him. Paul is bedridden for nearly 2 months, but his illness brings Mrs. Morel out of her mourning. Paul visits the Levers farm often in the fall. Miriam is romantic and very religious. She wants to be educated and improve her status. One day, Paul visits and chats with Miriam while she makes dinner. Miriam is distracted and burns the potatoes. They spend more time together, sharing an interest in nature. Paul teaches her algebra and paints at home. He attends art school once a week. Miriam shows Paul her favorite wild rose bush in the woods. They share an intimate moment before parting. But his mother gets angry at this. Now Paul feels very confused. Paul and Miriam don't think they are in love. Paul feels he is too practical for romance, and Miriam shies away from physical love. On Good Friday, when Paul is 19, they go on a walk. Miriam realizes she loves him. In a few days, they make more trips together. Strangely, Miriam begins to feel ashamed for desiring Paul. She stops visiting his house after insults from his family. Paul says they are only friends. One evening, they pick flowers and Paul pins them on her dress. Another day, they almost kiss while walking on the beach. The Morels turn against Miriam, and even Paul gets irritated by her intensity. Miriam continues to feel shameful for her desires. Gertrude's youngest son, Arthur, works at an electrical plant in Minton Pit. His restless nature causes trouble. One day, Mrs. Morel gets a letter from him saying he has impulsively joined the army but wants her to get him out. Mrs. Morel takes a train to Derby but can't get Arthur out of the army. In the meantime, Paul wins 2 first prizes in an art exhibition. Mrs. Morel is proud, and Paul is pleased to have made her happy. Miriam introduces Paul to Clara Dawes, a striking blonde. Paul gets very attracted by Clara's wit. She is separated from her husband and works for women's rights. Mr. Dawes works at Jordan's and Paul hates him for being a bully. In March, Paul and Miriam sit by the river. He senses that Miriam wants him, but he resists. He wants to give her passion and tenderness, but can't. Paul is often cruel to Miriam, but still feels drawn to her. He tells her he won't meet her because his family disapproves. This deeply hurts Miriam. Paul is promoted to manager after his supervisor goes away. His sister Annie is now engaged. When alone with Miriam, Paul resumes her French lessons. She writes a diary entry that reads like a love letter. Soon Annie tells Paul their mother is not well. Mrs. Morel is not happy with Miriam. She worries Paul will drain himself out for Miriam's sake. Paul assures his mother that he does not love Miriam. But his mother is not convinced. Paul says he likes to talk to Miriam because they are the same age. Mrs. Morel is deeply hurt by this. Paul pleads with her to believe him and moves over to her chair to kiss. Mr. Morel comes in at that moment and is enraged by the sight of the mother and son. He is drunk and angry. He fights with Paul. Paul wants his mother to sleep with him instead of his father, but she refuses. Paul feels happy that he loves his mother more than anyone. One day, Miriam takes Paul to see the daffodils. Paul watches as she kneels and kisses each flower. He bitterly remarks that she always caresses things and can't leave them alone. Paul tells Miriam they should break up because he can't physically love her. He and his family think it's inappropriate for him to visit so often without being engaged, and he doesn't love her enough to get engaged. They decide to see each other less. One day, Miriam invites Paul to meet Clara again. Paul notices Clara's body while talking to her. They go for a walk. Paul and Miriam pick flowers, but Clara is fascinated by a horse. Paul tells his mother he wishes he had a young mother. He shares his feelings about Clara with her. He likes Clara because she's kind of a rule breaker. Annie, Paul's sister, gets married. Paul promises his mother he will never marry and will live with her. Meanwhile, Arthur courts Beatrice. Paul spends time with Miriam and Clara, preferring Clara. He writes to Miriam, calling her a nun, and says they can only love spiritually, not physically. He stays friends with Miriam, but his interest in Clara grows. Paul wins first prize for a painting, selling it for 20 guineas. Morel is jealous of his son's success. Paul prefers to stay among common people, not join the middle class. Mrs. Morel urges Paul to meet a younger, uncomplicated woman of his own age. Arthur leaves the army, marries Beatrice, and their child is born 6 months later. Mrs. Morel finds him a job and helps pay for a cottage. Through Clara, Paul meets socialist and suffragette people. Paul tells Clara about the factory job and she gets it. The other girls at the factory do not like Clara, making her feel left out. One afternoon, Clara tells Paul about her marriage to Baxter Dawes. She had never really cared for him. She left him because he was cruel and cheated on her. Paul tries to explain his relationship with Miriam to Clara. Paul feels he should try to be intimate with Miriam. They kiss, but when Paul makes love to her, she stops him at the end. She admits she is afraid. Miriam's grandmother falls ill and Miriam cares for her. During the holidays, her grandmother feels better and stays with her daughter in Derby. With the house to herself, Miriam invites Paul. She cooks him a great dinner, and that night, Paul makes love to her for the first time. But he worries. Miriam does not enjoy intimacy. She says she will like it more when they are married. Paul's love for her fades and his interest in Clara grows. He tells his mother he will break up with Miriam. Paul tells Miriam they should break up and live separate lives since he does not want to marry her. They part. Paul goes to a bar, flirts with some girls, and soon forgets about Miriam. Paul rises in the art world, making money and friends. He spends more time with Clara. They walk along the riverbank, hold each other, kiss, and make love. Paul tells Clara he left Miriam because he did not want to marry her. Paul comes home late and tells his mother he was with Clara. He says he does not care what people say. One Sunday, Paul meets Clara at the train station. They walk to his home and Paul introduces her to his mother. Clara and Mrs. Morel get along well. Miriam arrives and Clara ignores her. Miriam leaves bitterly. Paul feels guilty and worse when he hears his mother and Clara discussing their hatred of Miriam behind her back. Clara accuses Paul of still having feelings for Miriam. Paul asks his mother if he likes Clara. Mrs. Morel says she does but believe Paul will grow bored of her. Paul and Clara see actress Sandra Bernhard perform in Nottingham. They wear fancy dress. After the play, Paul tells Clara he loves her. She invites him to her house. Clara gives Paul her husband's pajamas. They play cards while her mother, Mrs. Radford, prepares for bed. Paul cannot sleep that night. Mrs. Radford goes to bed. Paul goes to the kitchen and he sees Clara sitting by the fire. They kiss, but she refuses to go to his room, so he sleeps alone. A few days later, Paul is drinking with friends in a bar when Baxter Dawes enters. As he was senior to Dawes at Jordan's, Paul offers him a drink, but Dawes declines. He makes an insulting comment to him. Paul tries to ignore it, but the others tease him. Dawes hints he knows the woman Paul was with at the theater, and the men press Paul to name her. Dawes provokes Paul, who throws his beer in Dawes' face. Dawes rushes at Paul, and the men force Dawes to leave. Paul feels distanced from his mother. Clara is upset about his fight with Dawes and insists Paul carry a weapon for protection. A few days later, Paul bumps into Dawes at work. Dawes grabs him, but Jordan intervenes and tells Dawes to leave. Dawes throws Jordan to the floor before leaving. Jordan fires him and takes him to trial. Paul testifies, but the case is dismissed after the magistrate insults Dawes. Jordan thinks Paul gave away the case. Clara is angry. Paul mentioned her name in the trial. Back home, Paul tells his mother he does not always love Clara and feels he can never belong to any woman completely while his mother is alive. Clara remains passionately in love with Paul. He tells her he wants to go abroad and become a successful artist but cannot leave his mother yet. Clara asks what he will do if he succeeds. Paul says he will buy a nice house for him and his mother. Clara feels hurt and believes she can never have Paul completely. The next spring, Paul and Clara rent a seaside cottage. Clara swims while Paul watches the sunrise. He sees her far off in the water and thinks how small she looks. He wonders, why is he interested in her? Clara is upset that Paul only wants to spend time with her at night. She thinks she shouldn't want a divorce from Dawes since he belongs to her. She knows she and Paul will separate eventually. One night, Dawes finds Paul at the train station and punches him. Paul falls unconscious. Dawes runs away. Paul wakes up and goes home. In the morning, his mother sees his wounds and tends to him. He tells her about the fight and says he doesn't care about Miriam and Clara. Paul's relationship with Clara feels empty. He realizes his passion isn't truly for her. He and his mother avoid each other. Mrs. Morel stays with Annie. Paul visits her when she is sick. She reveals she has a tumor. The doctor says surgery is impossible. Paul promises to return next week. Clara tries to distract Paul from his mother's problems, but he can't forget. Mrs. Morel stays with Annie for 2 months, but her condition becomes worse. On the way home, Mrs. Morel is bright and lively, although she has such weakness. Neighbors come out to see her, knowing she will soon die. She is happy to be home and pleased to see her sunflowers growing in the yard. Mrs. Morel's doctor tells Paul that Baxter Dawes is in the hospital. Paul visits and finds Dawes very sick with typhoid. He leaves him some money. Clara feels guilty for her husband and tells Paul Dawes loved her more than Paul ever did. She pays a visit to Dawes to reconcile, but the distance between them is too great. Paul visits Dawes a few more times. In the meantime, Mrs. Morel's condition gets even worse, and Paul sees her pain. The cancer troubles her, and Paul wishes she would die to stop the pain. Paul is deeply affected and sometimes cannot work. He spends less time with Clara. In December, Paul stays home to care for his mother with Annie. The task is a torture for both. He and Annie decide to give her an overdose of morphia. He puts it in her milk. She sleeps heavily and dies in the morning. They have a funeral. Baxter Dawes heals slowly and stays with Paul at the seaside for a few days. Paul suggests that Clara and Dawes should reunite. Clara arrives the next day and Paul says he is leaving that afternoon. She feels irritated, thinking Paul is deliberately leaving her for her husband. She believes he has used her and now wants to return her to Dawes. After dinner, Paul leaves them. Clara asks Dawes if he wants her to stay. They hold each other, and Clara begs Dawes to take her back. They unite. Clara goes with Dawes to Sheffield. Paul hardly sees her after that. He moves to Nottingham. He can no longer paint. He spends his free time drinking in bars and continues to work at the factory. He tells himself to stay alive for his mother's sake. His soul swings between thoughts of life and death. He has nowhere to go. He sees Miriam at church one Sunday and asks her to supper. Miriam says she will teach at the farming college in Bruton. By the fire, Miriam suggests they marry. She wants to save him from wasting away. Paul refuses. He does not want her to sacrifice her life. Paul feels lost. He feels time has ceased and his mother is still with him, even in death. He calls out for her in the dark. He wants to join her, but no. He decides not to give in. Maybe he feels connected to the night and universe, sensing his mother's presence. There was the dark night, and on the other side, there was the soft, glowing city. He turns away and walks towards the city light, away from darkness and his mother. And that brings us to the end of Sons and Lovers. What do you think of the story? Write in the comment section. And if you love these stories, subscribe to our channel NibblePop. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Good night.